continued from the previous file, Literary Types, the Lyric. Page 60. Was poetry composed to be sung to the accompaniment of lyre or harp? In this sense, old ballads or even early epics might be described as lyrical. But the lyric, as we understand now, means personal or subjective poetry as distinguished from dramatic poetry, in which the moods and situations of other characters are captured and depicted. A lyric may be described as a short poem about a feeling, an emotion, or single idea. It expresses a feeling, but it may express an idea. But feeling is the essential quality. Even idea or thought is imbued with emotion. The poet finds an emotional equivalent to the thought or idea. Lyrical poetry is, however, distinguished from reflective poetry, which is longer and more thoughtful and more elaborate. Lyric poetry gives utterance to the poet's emotions of love and joy, of beauty and glory in nature and life. It may also record sorrows and disappointments and ugliness of life and nature. In romantic poetry, Wordsworth, in a number of short poems, expresses his love of nature, the beauties of nature as manifested in the varied aspects of nature, including men and women brought up in nature. Shelley expresses his fervent idealism, while Keats reveals his intense sensitiveness to beauty and his sensuous enjoyment of love and beauty. Lyric poetry depicts other kinds of love, as for example, love between God and man and love for one's own country. In bracket, as for example, Byron's On the Castle of Chillon, bracket closed. The sadder and darker aspects of life have also inspired the lyrical emotions, as for example, Coleridge's Ode on Dejection and Gray's Elegy. These poems are direct, formal, and musical. They capture one mood or emotion of the poet and communicate it to the readers in musical language and emotive imagery. Subjective element is the predominant component in this kind of lyrical poetry. Yeats's The Lake Isles of Innisfree reveals the sad mood of the poet, while Hardy's Weathers records a brighter mood. Many lyrical poems are highly intellectual and complicated. Wordsworth defines poetry as, quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, unquote. Again he says that poetry takes its origin from, quote, emotion recollected in tranquility, unquote. Thus, Wordsworth believes that feelings alone cannot make poetry. They must be meditated in quietness and worked upon by the mind in order to find the best ways of expressing them. As a matter of fact, intellectual element cannot be dispensed with. A poet has to do a lot of brain work, like recollection, meditation, choice of words and phrases, fitting the emotions to the rhyme and meter. Burns, in his poem A Red Rose, page 61, makes a hard intellectual effect to compose it. Subjective emotion is rendered in complicated imagery and rhyme. Donne writes lyrics which are dramatic in nature. He takes the emotion of a lover and analyzes it intellectually. He represents the different moods and emotions. Thus, his lyrics are necessarily the subjective or personal feelings of the poet. He can project the feelings of others. Browning also writes dramatic lyrics like Home Thoughts from Abroad, One Word More, etc. Lyric poetry does not only express an emotion, It expresses a thought. Donne's poetry is a fine amalgam of thought and emotion. Wordsworth, in his Lines Written on Tintern Abbey and Ode on Immortality, elaborate his philosophy of nature and childhood. But here, thoughts are transmuted into emotions. What moves the readers is not the thought, but the cry of the human heart for nature's soothing influence and for childhood innocence and wisdom. Browning's lyrics capture a situation, the situation of a rejected lover or an elated one. In bracket, the last ride together, two in the Campagna, bracket closed. In modern theory of poetry, lyrics are not expression of a subjective emotion, but an escape from it. T.S. Eliot thinks that poetry is the extinction of personality and not an expression of it. The poem is a structure. The poet dramatizes his mood and emotion through the structure of images and rhymes. Whatever may be the different methods and attitudes and theories, lyrics, intellectual, metaphysical, or dramatic, express the emotion of the poet. Personal emotions are organized in a detached, concentrated manner and transmuted into images without reference to personal history. Question 31. Examine the chief characteristics of the elegy or the ode as a lyric variants. Elegy is a lyric usually formal in tone and diction, suggested either by the death of an actual person or by the poet's contemplation of the tragic aspects of life. The term in Greek literature referred both to a specific verse form in bracket couplets consisting of a hexameter followed by a pentameter line, bracket closed, and to the emotions frequently conveyed by the verse form. Originally, any poem in this distich form was known as an elegy. In its simplest form, as in David's Lament for Saul and Jonathan, Lander's Rose Aylmer, and Tennyson's Break, 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 this is a brief lyric of mourning or direct utterance of personal bereavement and sorrow. But gradually it has expanded in many directions and undergone great elaboration. The 5 poems of the Book of Lamentations are dirges, page 62, not for an individual but over the fall of a city. It has grown into a memorial poem containing the poet's tribute to some great men, as for example Arnold's memorial verses, Whittier's in remembrance of Joseph Church, Ben Jonson's celebrated verses to the memory of my beloved, Mr. William Shakespeare. In early 16th century Italy, the content and subject matter of the elegy were taken over into terza rima by such writers as Bernardo Tasso and Ariosto. In Spain, the elegy began as imitations of Italian models, as in the Garcilaso de la Vega's first eclogue on the death of his lady in the tradition of the pastoral elegy. In France, the first attempt at copying the elegy form from the ancients was by imitating the classic distich in Alexandrine couplets. Ronsard, in his elegies, abandoned the attempt to reproduce the classical meter and returned to the subject matter of the elegy has been so little restricted that Sir Edmund Gosse said that the elegy as a poem of lamentation does not exist in Germany. Klopstock with greater metrical freedom, turn to sentimental subjects, general sadness, the troubles of love, as well as the memorializing of actual death. In England, there were a few Renaissance attempts, as for example by Sidney, Spenser and Harvey, to imitate the quantitative verse of the classical distich. The term elegy was used in the 16th and early 17th century for poems with a variety of content, including Petrarchan love poetry as well as laments. But the connection between death and elegy was made more clear with the use of, quote, funeral elegy, unquote, in the title of one section of Donne's An Anatomy of the World, in bracket 1611, bracket close. Milton's pastoral elegy, Lycidas, in bracket 1637, bracket closed, helped to establish the elegy, a lament for the dead, as a separate type in England. English poetry has not lacked meditative and reflective verse, but a distinction has grown up between meditative verse and elegy. Gray's elegy, written in the country churchyard, Young's Night Thoughts, Samuel Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes, belong to the former, while Pope's elegy on the death of an unfortunate lady, Tennyson's In Memoriam, belong to the elegiac tradition. Thus, in Greek and Latin literature, elegy meant the meter of a poem, in bracket alternating dactylic hexameters and pentameters, bracket closed. Later, because of the popularity of meditative or melancholy poems written in this meter, as for example Ovid's Heroids and Tristia, the term came to denote a reflective melancholy or commemorative poem. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, Dante and Petrarch wrote elegies on themes of love. Spenser wrote Tears of Muses and the Complaints in a meditative mood. Page 63. The pastoral type of elegy calls for special mention. It is derived from the Greek models from the time of Theocritus, Bion and Moschus, in bracket 100 BC, bracket closed. The structure of a pastoral elegy is determined by the form of the funeral service and is sung by a single shepherd, a close friend of the dead. In Milton's Lycidas, Milton himself, as an unknown shepherd, mourns for the untimely death of Lycidas, a shepherd. The pastoral elegy, illustrated in England by Shelley's Adonais, an elegy on the death of Keats and Thyrsis, Arnold's elegy on the death of Clough, derived from a different tradition, being thought of as a subdivision of the idyll or eclogue. In classical literature, the Lament for Bion, Virgil's fifth eclogue, the first idyll of Theocritus, and the 10th eclogue of Virgil, both of which combined the themes of love and death, were the chief models. Gray's elegy in a country churchyard and Arnold's Scholar Gypsy, in bracket, both employ the pastoral elements, bracket closed, are elegies in the more general sense of meditative poems. Tennyson, in his In Memoriam, discarded the pastoral convention. It is both a lament and a meditation. In the modern usage, ode is the name for the most formal, ceremonious and complexly organized form of lyric poetry, usually of considerable length. It is frequently the vehicle for public utterance on state occasions, as for example, a ruler's birthday, accession, funeral, and unveiling of some memorial or public work. The ode originated in ancient Greece, where it was sung to the accompaniment of dance and music during religious festivals. The term was generally used, quote, for any kind of lyrical composition, from the drinking songs of Anacreon to the love songs of Sappho, and from these again to the lofty occasional poems of Pindar, unquote. In ancient Greek literature, an ode was a long lyric or melic poem sung to the accompaniment of dance and music. In Greek poetry, there were two forms. One was called Horatian, from its later imitation by the Roman Horace, and consisted of a series of uniform stanzas such as those written by Alomen, Sappho, etc. The other was called the Doric ode, also Pindaric, designed for singing by groups of voices with its threefold structure: strophe, antistrophe, and epode. The second was the variety adopted by the great Greek dramatists. The Greek dramas have choral odes. Throughout Europe, the history of the ode commences with the rediscovery of the classic forms. The humanistic code of the 15th and earlier 16th centuries shows the adaptation of old meters to new subjects. Pindaric experiments were made by Trissino, page 64, Alamanni and Minturo, without establishing the ode as a new genre. More successful were the attempts in France by members of the Pléiade, where, after minor trials of the new form by others, Pierre de Ronsard in 1550 published the first 4 books of the odes, with stylistic imitation of Horace, Anacreon, and Pindar. Influenced by Ronsard, Tasso and Gabriele Sciabrera later in the century succeeded in popularizing the form in Italy. In France, the example of Ronsard was widely followed, notably by Boileau in the 17th century. In Germany, Klopstock modified the classic models by the use of free rhythms, grand abstract subjects. Later, Goethe and Schiller returned to classical models and feelings. In 1629 appeared the first great imitation of Pindar in England. Ben Jonson's Ode on the Death of Sir H. Morrison, with the strophe, antistrophe, and epode of the classical model. Milton wrote his great ode on the morning of Christ's Nativity in regular stanzaic form. Abraham Cowley's Pindaric odes captured the spirit and tone of Pindar. With Dryden begin the great formal odes of the 18th century. Alexander's Feast, Ode to the Memory of Mrs. Anne Killigrew, the Songs of St. Cecilia's Day. In the mid-18th century, the odes of Collins and Gray used less elaborate devices and more romantic themes. The true romantic ode in English literature begins with Coleridge's Dejection and Ode, and Wordsworth's Ode on Intimation of Immortality. Wordsworth's ode, with its varied line lengths, complex rhyme schemes, and stanzas of varying length and pattern, has been called the greatest English Pindaric ode. Of the other major Romantic poets, Shelley wrote the Ode to the West Wind, Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to Autumn, etc. Tennyson's Ode on the death of the Duke of Wellington, the formal Pindaric ode, has been neither a popular nor a successful one. Among modern poets, the personal ode in the Horatian manner has been revived with some success, notably by Alan Tate, in bracket, Ode to the Confederate Dead, bracket closed, and W. H. Auden, bracket, in memory of W. B. Yeats, bracket closed. In the modern sense, an ode is a rhymed, in bracket, rarely unrhymed, bracket closed, lyric, often in the form of an address. It is generally dignified and exalted in tone and feeling, full of deep reflection and earnest emotions. According to Edmund Gosse, an ode is, quote, a strain of enthusiastic and exalted lyrical verse directed to a fixed purpose and dealing progressively with one dignified theme, unquote. The ode is to be distinguished from the lyric, although it is a form of lyrical poetry. First, the ode is in the form of an address. Secondly, it has an elevation, page 65, of thought and dignity of style, which are not always seen in other lyrics. Thirdly, it has a slow or leisurely movement expressing the meditative mood of the poet, often breaking into poignant feeling. It has the expressiveness and equable temper which all lyrics do not have. The progressive evolution of thought to a climax is a dominant characteristic of an ode. In the English language, there are different types of odes. First, there are regular and simple odes. Secondly, there are irregular odes. Thirdly, there are regular Pindaric odes, in bracket, after the name of the Greek poet Pindar, bracket closed. Fourthly, there are Horatian odes, in bracket, after the name of the Greek poet Horace, bracket closed. Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to Autumn, Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, Wordsworth's Ode to Duty, Collins' Ode to Evening are regular and rhymed odes. Keats' stanza contains 10 lines. The stanzas in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn are composed of 5 iambic feet. The odes of Collins, Shelley and Wordsworth are also regular and rhymed with a definite arrangement of rhymes for such stanza. Wordsworth's Ode on Intimation of Immortality is irregular. The number of lines in different stanzas varies from 8 to 39. Dryden's Alexander's Feast and Tennyson's Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington are two other remarkable instances. Gray's Pindaric odes are the most successful example of this type. Ben Jonson's Ode to Himself and Marvell's Upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland are the notable specimens of the Horatian ode to English language. All these odes are addressed to some objects. They are marked by loftiness of theme and dignity of style. Ode to Duty and Immortality ode have lofty themes, elevated style and melodious language. They are elaborate lyrics with a slow and leisurely movement expressing the meditative mood of the poet. Keats and Shelley freed the ode from the old classical traditions of grandeur and over-intellectual elements. They made it a vehicle for the expression of deep feelings, sensations, and passions. The beauty of nature, the song of birds, the majesty of the storm are dealt with in a highly lyrical style. These poets celebrate beauty in a highly evocative language. They are unsurpassed for dignity of expression, haunting pathos, richness of imagery, and exquisite melody. Ode to the West Wind, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to Autumn reach a high watermark of English lyricism and have been regarded as the noblest achievements of human genius. Continued in the next file.